The day my package vanished was the day my HOA turned into a crime scene. "You stole those packages and I have proof," Linda Carver said, her voice cutting across the Copper Creek Estates HOA parking lot like a blade. She was jabbing her finger at me, her clipboard already out, a plastic badge clipped to her tan puffer vest glinting in the afternoon sun. I was still holding my car keys, halfway between my trunk and my front door, and now every neighbor within earshot was turning to stare. She tapped the badge with one nail and said, "You do not get special treatment." I teach high school history in Indianapolis, Indiana, and I had just gotten home from a long day of grading essays when this ambush started. Linda Carver was the treasurer of the Copper Creek Estates HOA, a rule she treated like a federal enforcement position. She had red shoulder-length straight hair, a black bucket hat, and the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. I looked at her clipboard, then at the small crowd forming near the mailbox cluster. And I said, "What are you talking about?" She pulled out her phone, waved it in the air like it was a warrant, and said, "I have messages proving you confessed to the package thefts. Everyone saw your post in the neighborhood chat." I felt my stomach drop because I had not posted anything in the neighborhood chat. I had barely even opened the app in weeks. But Linda was already turning to the neighbors and saying, "He admitted it right there in the comments. And now he is pretending he did not say it." A neighbor I barely knew, an older man in a Colts jersey, said, "Linda, what did he say exactly?" Linda did not miss a beat. She said, "He confessed to taking the packages from the porch deliveries, and he said he would return them if we did not press charges." I stared at her. I said, "I never said that. I never said anything like that." She smiled, the kind of smile that does not reach the eyes, and said, "The HOA will bill you for the theft investigation. And if you do not pay within 72 hours, we will suspend your parking privileges and report you to the police." I felt the weight of it hit me all at once. The accusations, the public shaming, the immediate consequences. I said, "Show me the message." Linda tucked her phone back into her pocket and said, "I do not owe you anything right now. You will get your formal notice in the mail." Then she turned and walked toward the management office, her key ring jingling on her belt like she was a mall cop. The neighbors were still staring at me, and I could feel the shift. They were not sure anymore. Some of them were already pulling out their own phones, probably checking the neighborhood chat to see if I had actually posted something. I went inside, locked the door, and opened the neighborhood app on my phone. The post Linda was talking about was from 3 days ago. A neighbor named Jill had written, "Packages are missing again from my porch. Has anyone else had this problem?" There were about 15 comments under it, and I scrolled through every single one. I had not commented. I had not even reacted to the post. But then I saw it. Linda had replied to Jill and said, "He confessed in a private message to me, and I am forwarding it to management." The he was not named, but Linda had tagged my username in a follow-up comment 2 posts down, and she had written, "This is the second time this month. We are taking action." I took a screenshot. Then I scrolled further and found another comment from Linda where she said, "I can fine you daily until you give up." That one was not even directed at me. It was a reply to someone else asking about parking violations. But the phrase stuck in my head like a warning. I grabbed my laptop and logged into the HOA portal to check my account. The page loaded, and there it was. A new violation notice dated 2 days ago, titled Theft Investigation Fee. The amount was $300, and the description said, "Resident under investigation for package theft, per board resolution." I had never received an email. I had never received a physical letter. but the system was showing the notice as delivered. I called the management office. The receptionist, a woman named Diane, answered and said, "Copper Creek Management. How can I help you?" I said, "This is Unit 47. I have a violation notice on my account that I never received, and I need to talk to someone about it." Diane put me on hold. When she came back, she said, "Linda Carver filed that notice, and per policy, you have to pay the fee before we can discuss the details." I said, "That does not make sense. I need to see the evidence first." Diane said, "I am sorry. That is the policy. If you do not pay within 72 hours, additional penalties will apply." I hung up and sat there staring at the screen. Linda had locked me out of my own defense. I could not submit evidence through the portal because the system flagged my account as restricted. I could not talk to management without paying first. And I could not clear my name in the neighborhood chat because Linda was already repeating her story to anyone who would listen. The next morning, I woke up to another post in the neighborhood app. This one was from Linda, and it was titled "Safety Alert." She had written, "A resident has been identified in the package theft incidents, and the HOA is working with law enforcement to resolve the matter. Please secure your deliveries and report any suspicious activity to the board immediately." She did not name me directly, but she did not have to. Half the neighbors already thought I was guilty, and now the rest were going to assume it. I grabbed my jacket, my gray bucket hat, and the key ring clipped to my belt, and I walked down to the mailbox cluster. The cluster sat at the corner of the townhouse row, a big metal box with individual compartments for each unit. When I got there, I found Jill standing by her mailbox holding a torn padded mailer. The mailer had ripped seams and no readable markings, just shredded brown paper and packing tape hanging off the edges. She looked up at me and said, "Did you do this?" I said, "No." Jill said, "Linda told me you confessed." I said, "Linda is lying." Jill looked at the mailer, then back at me, and said, "This was in my package. It showed up near your trash bins this morning." I felt my chest tighten. I said, "Someone planted that." Jill shook her head and walked away, and I was left standing there with the mailbox door still open, and the feeling that I was losing ground fast. I went back to my unit and started looking for proof. I did not have a doorbell camera, but my neighbor 2 doors down, a guy named Marcus, did. I knocked on his door and asked if I could check his footage from the last week. Marcus was hesitant at first, but he let me in and pulled up the app on his phone. We scrolled through the clips. Most of them were just delivery drivers dropping off packages, people walking dogs, the usual neighborhood traffic. Then, we found something. A clip from 2 nights ago showed a figure in a tan puffer vest and black bucket hat walking up to my trash bins, bending down and placing something near the edge. The timestamp was partially covered by a glitch strip at the bottom of the screen, and the angle did not show the face clearly, but the clothing matched Linda exactly. I said, "Can you send me that clip?" Marcus said, "I do not want to get involved in HOA drama." I said, "I just need the file." He hesitated, then airdropped it to my phone. The clip was only 15 seconds long and the timestamp strip was unreadable because of the glitch, but it was something. I saved it and thanked Marcus, then I went back to my unit and started planning my next move. I needed more evidence. I needed something concrete that would prove Linda was framing me, and I needed it fast because the 72-hour deadline was ticking down. That afternoon, I got a notification from the HOA portal. Another notice had been posted to my account. This one was titled "Parking Suspension Pending Payment." I opened it and read the text. It said that if I did not pay the investigation fee by 5 p.m. the next day, my parking pass would be revoked and my vehicle would be subject to towing. I looked out my window at my car sitting in the assigned spot and felt the anger start to build. Linda was not just accusing me, she was systematically dismantling my ability to function in my own home. I grabbed my phone and called the management office again. Diane answered and said, "We already told you, you have to pay first." I said, "I have evidence that contradicts the accusation." Diane said, "You can submit that after you pay the fee." I said, "That is not how due process works." She said, "This is private property, and the board sets the rules." Then she hung up. I sat there staring at the phone. I had 30 hours left before they could tow my car, and I still did not have enough proof to force a reversal. I needed a third clue, something that would tie everything together. I thought about the timeline. The first accusation came from Linda in the neighborhood chat 3 days ago. The violation notice was dated 2 days ago. The mailer showed up near my bins this morning. But the doorbell clip from Marcus showed Linda near my bins 2 nights ago, which would have been before Jill found the mailer. That meant Linda had planted the evidence before she even filed the formal accusation. I opened my laptop and logged into the HOA portal again. This time, I went to the document archive and started searching for any records related to theft complaints. I found a folder labeled Board Resolutions, and inside it was a PDF titled Investigation Protocol. I downloaded it and opened the file. The metadata at the bottom of the screen showed a creation date from last week, 3 days before the first neighborhood post. I took a screenshot of the metadata screen. Then I cross-referenced the policy with the timeline, and it became clear. Linda had written the investigation protocol specifically to target me, and she had backdated the resolution to make it look official. I now had 3 pieces of evidence: the doorbell clip showing Linda planting the mailer, the metadata showing she backdated the policy, and the timeline mismatch proving she filed the accusation before the evidence even appeared. I printed everything out, put it in a binder with tabbed sections, and got ready to take it to the management office in person. But then I got another notification. This one was an email from a towing company called Rapid Tow Services. The subject line said Tow Authorization Copper Creek Unit 47. I opened it. The email said that per HOA request, my vehicle was scheduled for removal the following morning at 8 a.m. unless payment was received by 5 p.m. today. I checked the time. It was 4:30. The management office closed at 5, and the walk-in cutoff was 4:45. I grabbed the binder, my keys, and my jacket, and I ran out the door. The management office was in a small building near the front gate of the community, a 1-story brick structure with a reception window and a waiting area that always smelled like burnt coffee. I got there at 4:42 and pushed through the door. Diane was at the window, and she looked up and said, "We are closing soon." I said, "I need to submit evidence for my violation dispute." She said, "You have to pay the fee first." I said, "I am not paying a fraudulent charge." The door behind me slammed open, and Linda Carver walked in. She had a portable printer in one hand, the kind that runs on batteries and prints receipts, and her clipboard in the other. She looked at me, then at Diane, and said, "Do not process anything for him until he pays." Diane nodded. Linda set the printer on the counter and said, "I am issuing an additional notice right now for obstruction." She fed a slip of paper into the printer, pressed a button, and the machine whirred to life. A moment later, it spit out a printed notice with my unit number at the top and a line about obstruction of HOA procedures. Linda handed it to Diane and said, "Add this to his account." I said, "You are making this up as you go." Linda tapped her plastic badge and said, "You do not get special treatment." Then she turned to Diane and said, "Call the tow company and confirm the morning pickup." I slammed the binder on the counter and said, "I have proof you planted evidence." Linda did not even look at the binder. She said, We do not accept documents from residents under investigation. Diane started reaching for the phone. I said, "You are breaking your own rules." Linda smiled and said, "The board makes the rules, and I am the board treasurer. If you do not like it, you can file an appeal after you pay." I looked at Diane. I said, "Are you really going to let this happen?" Diane said, "I just follow the policies." I opened the binder and pulled out the screenshot of the metadata. I said, "This policy was created last week." Linda filed the accusation before the evidence even existed. Linda turned to Diane and said, "Do not look at that." But Diane was already looking. Her expression shifted slightly, just a flicker of doubt, and Linda saw it. Linda said, "He is trying to manipulate you." She grabbed the screenshot out of my hand and crumpled it. I said, "I have copies." Linda pulled out her key ring and jingled it in the air, the keys clanging together like some kind of power move. She said, "I have access to every restricted area in this community, and I can audit your storage space whenever I want." I said, "You are not auditing anything." Linda said, "The HOA will bill you daily until you comply. And if you keep pushing, I will blacklist you with every vendor we use. That means no towing exceptions, no maintenance calls, no package holds. You will be cut off." I felt the room tilt. She was not just threatening fees anymore, she was threatening to isolate me completely. I said, "You are abusing your position." Linda said, "I am enforcing the rules." Then she turned to Diane and said, "Print his tow authorization and make sure the driver knows to arrive early." Diane hesitated, and Linda snapped now. Diane started typing, and I knew I was losing. The clock on the wall said 4:53. The office was closing in 7 minutes, and if I did not stop this now, my car was getting towed in the morning and I would be stuck fighting uphill for weeks. I pulled out my phone and opened the doorbell clip Marcus had sent me. I turned the screen toward Diane and said, "Watch this." Linda tried to grab the phone, but I stepped back. The clip played. 15 seconds of grainy footage showing a figure in a tan puffer vest and black bucket hat placing something near my trash bins. The timestamp strip was unreadable, but the clothing was unmistakable. Diane watched the whole thing, and when it ended, she looked at Linda. She said, "Is that you?" Linda said, "That could be anyone." I said, "That is your vest, your hat, and your exact build." Diane said, "Linda, if you planted evidence, that is fraud." Linda's face went red. She said, "You are out of line." Diane said, "I am calling the property manager." Linda said, "I am the treasurer. I am your boss." Diane picked up the phone and dialed. Linda looked at me, then at the door and said, "This is not over." Then she grabbed her portable printer and walked out. The door swung shut behind her, and I stood there breathing hard, the binder still open on the counter. Diane finished her call and hung up. She said, "The property manager wants to see all your evidence tomorrow morning. Bring everything." I said, "What about the tow?" Diane said, "I am canceling it right now." She typed something into the computer, then picked up the phone again and called Rapid Tow Services. I heard her say, "Cancel the authorization for Unit 47, effective immediately." She hung up and looked at me. She said, "You should file a formal complaint against Linda with the property management company." I said, "I will." Diane handed me a form and said, "Fill this out and bring it with you tomorrow." I took the form, thanked her, and walked out into the parking lot. The sun was setting, and the townhouse row looked quiet, but I knew the fight was not over. Linda was going to regroup, and she was going to come back harder. That night I printed out every piece of evidence I had: the doorbell clip screenshot, The metadata screenshot, the timeline breakdown, the email from the tow company, and the neighborhood chat screenshots showing Linda's escalating accusations. I put them all in the binder with color-coded tabs and a summary page at the front. Then I called my ally, a mailroom worker named Derek who had been sorting packages for Copper Creek for 2 years. Derek had noticed a pattern. Packages were disappearing, but only from certain units, and only on days when Linda was on site doing HOA walkthroughs. I had talked to Derek a few days ago, and he had agreed to keep an eye out for anything unusual. If you are enjoying this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more wild HOA tales, because this is about to get even crazier. I met Derek at the mailroom the next morning. He said, "I found something." He pulled out his phone and showed me a photo. It was a shot of the restricted storage area behind the mailroom, a space that only HOA board members and maintenance staff were supposed to access. In the photo, there was a plastic bin pushed into the corner, and inside the bin were several unopened packages with address labels still attached. The photo did not show any readable text on the labels, but the bin itself was clear enough. Derek said, "That bin was not there last week." I said, "Who has access to that room?" Derek said, "Just the board members and me." I said, "Did you see Linda in there?" Derek said, "She was in there yesterday afternoon with her key ring." I took a screenshot of the photo and added it to my binder. Then I asked Derek if he would be willing to make a statement. He said, "I do not want to get fired." I said, "You do not have to go public. Just write down what you saw and sign it." He thought about it, then nodded. He wrote a 1-page statement on his phone, emailed it to me, and said, "Good luck." I thanked him and headed to the property management meeting. The meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. in the same office where I had confronted Linda the day before. When I walked in, the property manager, a man named Greg, was sitting at a desk with Diane standing next to him. Linda was not there yet. Greg said, "Let me see what you have." I handed him the binder. He flipped through the tabs, pausing on the doorbell clip screenshot, the metadata page, and Derek's statement. He said, "This is serious." I said, "Linda framed me for theft, planted evidence, and used her position to intimidate staff and vendors." Greg said, "I am going to need to verify this with the board." I said, "Linda is on the board." Greg said, "I understand, but I still have to follow the process." Then the door opened, and Linda walked in. She looked at me, then at Greg, and said, "What is this?" Greg said, "We are reviewing a complaint." Linda said, "From him? He is under investigation." Greg said, "The investigation is paused until we sort this out." Linda's face went red. She said, "I am the treasurer. I filed that investigation, and you do not have the authority to pause it." Greg said, "The property management company has oversight on fraud allegations, and that is what this is." Linda slammed her clipboard on the desk and said, "He is manipulating you." Greg said, "I have video evidence, metadata, and a witness statement." Linda said, "That video does not prove anything." Greg opened the binder to the timeline page and said, "The video shows you near the trash bins the night before the evidence appeared. The metadata shows you created the investigation policy the same day you posted the accusation. And the witness statement says you had access to a restricted storage area where stolen packages were found." Linda stared at the page, and for the first time, she did not have a comeback ready. Greg said, "I am suspending your access to HOA systems pending a full board review." Linda said, "You cannot do that." Greg said, "I just did." He pulled a printed letter from a folder and slid it across the desk. It was a formal suspension notice, dated that morning. Linda grabbed the letter, read it, and said, "This is illegal." Greg said, "It is not. The management contract gives us authority to intervene in cases of board misconduct. Linda said, I will sue. Greg said, you are welcome to try. Then he looked at Diane and said, revoke her portal access and change the locks on the restricted areas. Diane nodded and started typing. Linda looked at me and said, you think you won. This is not over. I said, it is for you. Linda grabbed her clipboard and walked out, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. Greg looked at me and said, we are refunding your investigation fee and removing the violation from your account. I will send you a confirmation email by end of day. I said, what about the stolen packages? Greg said, we are contacting the police and turning over Derek's photo and the witness statement. Linda is going to have to answer for that. I said, what happens to her? Greg said, that is up to the board, but she is not getting her access back without a full vote, and I do not see that happening. I thanked him and walked out. The parking lot was quiet, and I felt the tension start to lift. But I knew Linda was not done. She still had allies on the board, and she was not the type to go quietly. That afternoon, I got a call from Rapid Tow Services. The driver, a guy named Phil, said, hey, I need to talk to you about something. I said, what is it? Phil said, Linda Carver has been calling our office for the last month asking us to prioritize tows in your community, and she has been skipping the required notification steps. My boss just found out and he is pissed. I said, what do you mean skipping steps? Phil said, she has been giving us tow authorizations without sending the 72-hour warnings to residents first. That is a contract violation. My boss is cutting ties with the HOA. I said, can you put that in writing? Phil said, my boss already sent a letter to the property manager. I just wanted to give you a heads up because Linda mentioned your name specifically in one of her calls. I thanked Phil and hung up. That was the twist I needed. Linda had not just been abusing her HOA authority, she had been pressuring vendors to bend the rules. And now, the vendors were turning on her. I forwarded Phil's information to Greg and asked him to include it in the board review. He replied within an hour and said it was already part of the file. The next day, I ran into a neighbor named Claire near the mailbox cluster. Claire was the one who had been recording on her phone when Linda first accused me in the parking lot. She said, I saw what happened with Linda. I have the whole thing on video. I said, can I see it? Claire pulled out her phone and played the clip. It was a 2-minute recording starting from the moment Linda pointed at me and said I had stolen the packages. The audio was clear, and you could hear Linda say, I can fine you daily until you give up. That line, the one she had used in the neighborhood chat about parking violations, was now on video in the context of the theft accusation. It was the boomerang I had been waiting for. I said, can you send that to me? Claire said, already done. She airdropped the file, and I saved it immediately. I added it to my binder as the 4th piece of evidence. Now I had the doorbell clip, the metadata, the witness statement, the vendor admission, and a recording of Linda threatening me in public. It was overkill, but I wanted to make sure there was no room for her to wiggle out. That afternoon, I got an email from Greg. The subject line said, board review scheduled. The email said that the board was holding an emergency meeting the following week to review Linda's conduct, and I was invited to attend as a witness if I wanted to. I did not want to sit through a board meeting. I wanted this done in the field, in front of people where Linda could not hide behind procedure. So I made a plan. The next day, Linda was scheduled to meet with a landscaping vendor in the parking lot near the clubhouse. I knew this because Diane had accidentally CC'd me on a scheduling email. I showed up 10 minutes early with my binder and my phone, and I waited. At 2 p.m., a truck from Green Edge Landscaping pulled into the lot, and a woman in a company shirt got out. Linda arrived a minute later, clipboard in hand, and walked over to the vendor. I followed. Linda saw me coming and said, "You need to leave." I said, "I am a resident. I can be here." The vendor looked between us and said, "Is there a problem?" Linda said, "No, we are just finalizing the contract." I said, "Before you sign anything, you should know that Linda Carver has been using her HOA position to pressure vendors into skipping required steps." The vendor said, "What are you talking about?" I pulled out my phone and showed her the email from Rapid Tow Services. I said, "This tow company just cut ties with the HOA because Linda was bypassing notification rules." The vendor read the email, then looked at Linda. She said, "Is that true?" Linda said, "He is lying." I said, "I have a letter from the tow company and a statement from the property manager confirming it." The vendor said, "I need to talk to my boss." She got back in her truck and drove off. Linda turned to me and said, "You just cost the HOA a contract." I said, "You cost the HOA a contract when you started abusing your authority." Linda said, "You think you are clever." I said, "I think I am right." Linda stepped closer and said, "I am going to make sure you regret this." I said, "Go ahead. I have everything on record." She pulled out her phone and started to say something, but before she could finish, Claire walked up from the sidewalk. She said, "I am still recording, Linda." Linda froze. Claire held up her phone, the red recording dot visible on the screen, and said, "You just threatened him again." Linda looked at the phone, then at me, then at Claire. Her face went pale. She said, "You are both going to regret this." Then she turned and walked toward the clubhouse. Claire stopped the recording and said, "I am sending this to the property manager right now." I said, "Thank you." Claire said, "No problem. I am tired of her bullying people." The next morning, I got another email from Greg. This one said that the board meeting had been moved up to that afternoon due to new evidence. He asked if I could come to the office at 4 p.m. and bring all my documentation. I said yes. When I arrived, the small conference room was packed. 3 board members, Greg, Diane, and a lawyer from the property management company were all sitting around a table. Linda was not there yet. Greg said, "We are going to go through your evidence first. Then we will bring Linda in." I handed him the binder. He opened it and started walking through each tab with the board members. The doorbell clip, the metadata, the witness statement, the vendor letter, the recording from Claire. One of the board members, a woman named Sandra, said, "This is damning." Another board member, a man named Tom, said, "Why did we not catch this earlier?" Greg said, "Because Linda controlled the documentation process and locked out anyone who questioned her." Sandra said, "This is fraud." The lawyer nodded and said, "If the police investigation confirms the stolen packages in the storage area, Linda could face criminal charges." Tom said, "What about the HOA?" The lawyer said, "You will need to issue a formal reprimand, remove her from the board, and cooperate fully with law enforcement." At 4:15, Linda walked in. She saw me sitting at the table and said, "What is he doing here?" Greg said, "He is a witness." Linda said, "This is a closed board meeting." Greg said, "Not anymore. Sit down." Linda sat, her clipboard clutched in her lap, and Greg started laying out the evidence. He went through each piece one by one, and Linda's face got redder with every page. When he got to the vendor letter, Linda said, That driver is lying. Greg said, we have a signed affidavit. When he got to the recording, Linda said, that is out of context. Greg played the clip. Linda's voice came through the speaker, clear as day, saying, I can fine you daily until you give up. The room went silent. Sandra said, Linda, did you plant evidence? Linda said, no. Tom said, did you create the investigation policy to target him specifically? Linda said, I was following board guidelines. Greg said, the metadata shows you created the policy the same day you posted the accusation. That is not following guidelines, that is making them up. Linda stood up and said, I am not going to sit here and be interrogated. Sandra said, sit down or we will vote to remove you right now. Linda sat. The lawyer said, the property management company is recommending immediate suspension pending the outcome of the police investigation. The board needs to vote. Sandra said, I move to suspend Linda Carver from all HOA duties effective immediately. Tom said, I second. Greg said, all in favor. 3 hands went up. Greg said, motion passes. Linda, you are suspended. Your access is revoked, and you are required to return all HOA property, including keys, badges, and documents within 24 hours. Linda stood up, grabbed her clipboard, and said, you are all going to regret this. Then she walked out. The door slammed behind her, and the room exhaled. Sandra looked at me and said, I am sorry this happened. I said, just make sure it does not happen to anyone else. Greg said, we are implementing new oversight policies and requiring dual authorization for all enforcement actions. I said, good. Then I pulled out the side-by-side timeline I had printed earlier, the one that showed Linda's actions in chronological order with the dates highlighted. I handed copies to everyone at the table and said, this is for your records. The timeline showed the exact sequence: policy creation, accusation post, evidence planting, violation notice, tow authorization, vendor pressure, and finally, the frame-up collapse. It was all there in a single page, color-coded and annotated. Sandra took one look at it and said, this is going in the file. The lawyer said, we will need this for the police report as well. I said, I already sent a copy to the detective handling the theft case. Greg said, when did you do that? I said, this morning. I wanted to make sure law enforcement had the full picture before Linda could spin it. The lawyer smiled and said, smart. The meeting wrapped up, and I walked out into the parking lot feeling lighter than I had in days. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Claire. She said, did they suspend her? I replied, yes. She sent back a thumbs-up emoji. That evening, I got a call from Detective Morris, the officer handling the package theft investigation. He said, we executed a search of the storage area and found 12 packages that did not belong there. The address labels match reports from residents in your community. We are bringing Linda Carver in for questioning tomorrow. I said, what happens now? Detective Morris said, if she does not cooperate, we will file charges for theft and fraud. Either way, this is going to stick. I thanked him and hung up. The next day I heard from Derek that Linda had shown up at the mailroom trying to get into the restricted area with her old key. The lock had been changed, and when she could not get in, she started yelling at Derek. Derek called security and they escorted her off the property. 2 days later, I got a notification from the HOA portal. My investigation fee had been refunded in full, and the violation notice had been removed from my account. There was also a formal apology letter from the board. signed by Sandra and Tom. The letter said, "We sincerely apologize for the distress caused by the actions of a former board member. The Copper Creek Estates HOA is committed to fair and transparent governance, and we are implementing new policies to prevent this from happening again." It was a standard corporate apology, but it was something. I printed it and added it to my binder. The following week, I ran into Sandra at the mailbox cluster. She said the police filed charges against Linda: theft, fraud, and abuse of authority. She is facing up to 3 years if convicted. I said, "Good." Sandra said, "The board is also voting to ban her from serving in any HOA leadership role in the future." I said, "That should have been done years ago." Sandra said, "You are right. We let her get away with too much for too long." I said, "Just make sure the next treasurer does not have a portable printer." Sandra laughed, a short, bitter sound, and said, "We are changing the rules. No board member can issue enforcement actions without a second signature." A few days after that, I got a message in the neighborhood app. It was from Jill, the neighbor who had confronted me with the torn mailer. She said, "I owe you an apology. I believed Linda without asking questions, and that was wrong. I am sorry." I replied, "Apology accepted. Just do not let it happen again." She sent back a heart emoji, and I closed the app. The community was starting to feel normal again. People were saying hello in the parking lot. The neighborhood chat was back to boring posts about lost pets and trash pickup schedules. It was not perfect, but it was better. One afternoon, I was walking to my car when I saw a tow truck pull into the lot. For a second, my chest tightened, but then I recognized the driver. It was Phil from Rapid Tow Services. He waved and walked over. He said, "I wanted to let you know. We are not working with Copper Creek anymore. My boss sent the contract cancellation letter last week." I said, "Because of Linda?" Phil said, "Yeah, she burned too many bridges. My boss does not want to work with an HOA that plays games like that." I said, "Good call." Phil said, "For what it is worth, I am glad you fought back. Most people just take the hit and move on." I said, "I am a teacher. I do not let bullies win." Phil laughed and got back in his truck. I watched him drive off, then I got in my car and headed to work. That night, I opened my laptop and logged into the HOA portal one last time. My account was clean. No violations, no pending fees, no restrictions. I clicked through to the board member directory and saw that Linda's name had been removed. In her place was a note that said, "Position vacant, election scheduled for next month." I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. It was over. Linda was facing criminal charges, the HOA had implemented new oversight policies, and I had my reputation back. It was not just a win, it was a total dismantling of everything she had tried to build against me. A week later, I was sitting on my porch when Marcus walked by. He stopped and said, "Hey, I heard what happened with Linda. That was crazy." I said, "Yeah." Marcus said, "I should have sent you that footage sooner." I said, "You sent it when I needed it. That is what matters." Marcus said, "If it happens again, I will be the first one to speak up." I said, "Let us hope it does not happen again." Marcus nodded and kept walking. I sat there watching the townhouse rows settle into the evening, the street lights flickering on one by one, and I felt something close to peace. The following month, the HOA held its election. I did not run, but I showed up to vote. The new treasurer was a retired accountant named Bill who promised transparency and regular audits. He won by a landslide. At the end of the meeting, Sandra announced that the board was creating a resident oversight committee to review enforcement actions before they were finalized. She asked for volunteers, and I raised my hand. 3 other residents did the same. We were all approved, and the committee was scheduled to meet quarterly. It was a small change, but it was a start. A few weeks after that, I got a call from Detective Morris. He said Linda Carver pleaded guilty to theft and fraud. She is getting 2 years probation, community service, and a permanent ban from serving on any HOA board in the state. I said, that is it. Detective Morris said, she also has to pay restitution to the victims, and if she violates probation, she goes to jail. I said, good. Detective Morris said, you did the right thing by documenting everything. A lot of people would have just walked away. I said, I could not afford to walk away. Detective Morris said, well, it paid off. Take care. I hung up and sat there for a minute, letting it sink in. Linda was done. The HOA was reforming, and I was still standing. That evening, I got a message from Derek. He said, thanks for standing up for all of us. I did not think anyone would call out Linda, but you did. I replied, thanks for helping. You were the key witness. Derek said, anytime. If you need anything else, let me know. I closed the message and went back to grading essays. Life was getting back to normal, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. The fight was over, the evidence had held up, and the system, for once, had worked the way it was supposed to. Linda Carver was banned, the HOA was reformed, and my name was cleared. It was not just a win, it was a complete reversal. And the best part was, I had done it all by the book. No vandalism, no fraud, no breaking the rules. Just evidence, persistence, and a refusal to back down. The side-by-side timeline I had printed and handed out in front of everyone became part of the permanent HOA file. A reminder of what happens when someone tries to abuse power without accountability. Management disciplined the staff process that had enabled Linda's frame-up, and the board voted to require dual authorization on all enforcement actions going forward. Karen, or Linda in this case, stormed out when the room turned against her, and she never came back. The funny karma beat came when the recording Claire made caught Linda repeating her threat, "I can fine you daily until you give up," in a context that made it clear she was weaponizing HOA rules for personal vendettas. That line, which she had used so confidently in the neighborhood chat, became the smoking gun that turned the board and the vendors against her. And the final humiliation moment, the one that sealed everything, was when I played the doorbell clip in front of witnesses during the parking lot confrontation, and Linda froze mid-rant, unable to explain why she was on camera planting evidence near my trash bins. The look on her face was worth every sleepless night and every minute I spent building that binder. The fight was over, the revenge was lawful, and the payoff was real. Linda lost her position, her reputation, and her freedom to ever serve on an HOA board again. I got my fees refunded, my violations removed, and my life back. And the community got new policies that would protect residents from ever going through what I went through. It was not a perfect ending, but it was a satisfying one. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.